We will be relentlessly aggressive in countering and disrupting attempts by
In
Russia,
early September,
Iran,
the United States
as well
imposed
as
sanctions
China,
on Russia
or
due to
any
its
other
hostile
foreign
information operations against the U.S. Today, we take a look at how Russian influence operations abroad are organized, what is their scale, what course they take, and what instruments they use to achieve their goals.
Na celowniku tych operacji wpływu
The target of these influence operations was not only the US, but also other European countries, as previously reported by various institutions observing Russia's information activities in the media sphere, and also EU organizations. Germany, France, and Poland were among those countries targeted by the Russians. In Poland, Russian activity consisted of creating fake websites of real media outlets, such as weekly Polityka or the Polish radio. Fake content was published there to turn Poles against the European Union. It has also been proven that these fake social media accounts were created en masse to push coverage that was useful for Russia's point of view. Information revealed by the Americans shows that Russia's primary goal was to discourage the American public and decision-makers from supporting Ukraine militarily and financially. From the Kremlin's point of view, this is a key issue. This war is very significant for them in terms of sustaining the Russian regime and its foreign influence, which the Kremlin is struggling to increase at the moment. A common name for the influence operations described by the Americans is Doppelganger, which in German means double and captures, among other characteristics, the Russian actions of creating duplicates and fakes of existing websites. American material reveals how the Russians operated. First, they created duplicate sites of real media outlets in the US, such as The Washington Post or Fox News. Next, they created huge numbers of online accounts, which were troll accounts that commented on various issues. Then, real articles and real opinions in existing media that matched the Russian narrative were used. Finally, and this was very visible in the US, American commentators and influencers who had views that more or less coincided with the Russian narrative were acquired through Russian organizations and people who cooperated with the Russian TV station RT, formerly known as Russia Today. And we need to remember that RT is a state-controlled Russian media outlet. Once cooperation was established, these views were radicalized, which was then exploited by the Russian media and Russian trolls. This whole system that the Russians created as part of Operation Doppelganger shows how systematically Russia operates and the enormous scale of its operations. This involved, among other things, the creation of an interconnected system of different information channels that shared the same narrative and referenced each other as their sources. It created a whole network that was quite convincing to a person who happened to be within its reach. The sanctions and US accusations against the Russians were, of course, addressed by Russian propaganda. Among other things, Vladimir Solovyov famously argued in his program that the Americans are wrong, and that this entire initiative is aimed at stigmatizing Russians and is a de facto cynical action against democracy and freedom of speech.
Can you imagine what they would do to Margarita and her colleagues, who of course are to blame? They are to blame because they tell people the truth, all over the world, risking their lives. RT reporters are telling the truth, including to the sellout political elite of the West, who are doing everything they can to prevent their people from knowing the truth. These are not double standards, forget these words. This is a war that these bastards are waging against our country.
Margarita Simonyan also addressed the allegations, but in a slightly different tone. First, she criticized the sanctions and then ironically turned to the Americans, asking, "What did you expect? Who else could direct the operations of Russian RT television other than the Kremlin?" And this is a very interesting statement and worth remembering, because it's a straightforward admission of guilt and acknowledgement of the fact that Russian television RT is carrying out the Kremlin's tasks in the international environment. What interested them the most was whether I was getting orders from the Kremlin. Listen, comrades, what did you expect? That I get orders from the CIA? And where should I get my orders from if I represent a Russian state-funded media outlet? I am proud to work for my country. Write this down. All RT staff and the chief editor personally obey orders only from the Kremlin, and all the other orders go straight to the toilet. Write this down, get a translator, maybe he can decipher it for you. There is also an element of humor in this, which you people won't understand anyway.
Zaangażowanie telewizji RT w przeprowadzanie
The
informacji
involvement of RT in carrying out information operations in the West is a common element of another interesting story that has recently caused a huge stir in the international news media. Namely, the screening of a Russian film made by director Anastasia Trofimova, which premiered at this year's Venice Film Festival. The film was shown in an out-of-competition screening, but it nevertheless sparked a huge discussion about how a Russian film could find its way to the festival in the first place. In particular, a great deal of questions were raised by the director's statements about how the film was made.
Сегодня мы выдвигаемся на фронт. Еду я на свой страх и риск, само собой, без любого разрешения Министерства обороны, немножко втайне от них.
Настя, а ты куда вот это снимаешь?
Документальное кино.
Это фильм про нас будет. Где будет правда?
Sam film, zatytułowany przez
The documentary, entitled Russians at War, is not available to the general public. It premiered at the festival and is not available at this time either online or in any other sources. Therefore, we can only refer to the director's statements, to the documentary's trailer, which is available online, and to the opinions of commentators who managed to watch the film during the festival. In particular, there are many questions about how the film was made. The director argues that she spontaneously went to the front line while Russian troops were attacking Ukraine's Bakhmut, and there, for 7 months, she collected footage for the film. Yet we can assume that she wasn't there on her own, as a single person, but together with an entire film crew, because the film is actually a professional documentary production.
całą ekipą filmową, bowiem film przygotowany jest w pełni profesjonalnie.
Россия и Украина, все это было неразделимо.
По братскому союзу я скучаю. Даже вот когда я дерусь в драке, мне всегда нужно знать, что я прав. Мы полезли в драку на Украину, но я себя не чувствую правым.
Был отдан приказ. Мы вошли.
Ну, думаешь, это правильный был приказ?
Не знаю.
Я пошел сегодня для того, чтобы завтра не пошли мои дети.
Wątpliwości budzi to, jak
It's questionable how, in the Russian reality at the moment, with censorship and the repression of the media and journalists in general, an ordinary person can go to the front line and record any footage. Russian independent journalists point out that they have no access to the front line from the Russian side, and any attempt to somehow publish coverage from there is met with resistance from the authorities.
Я сам в течение года снимал военных в Украине.
I myself filmed soldiers in Ukraine for a year. Ukraine is indeed a democratic country, a free country. But at the same time, I actually had the accreditation of the armed forces of Ukraine. I had the personal approval of Zaluzhny and so on, that I'm a kind of well-known director. But the idea of just getting in a car and driving there. And I needed to shoot one scene in Russia. The cameraman, on my instructions, went out into the street and they arrested him. At night in Moscow, he went out on the street. He spent the night in the police station. And in this case, some person goes, passes all checkpoints, films their shots, returns 4 times. For 7 months she is at the front. At once they give her a uniform and do what she wants. My dear friends, who are they trying to kid here?
wypowiedzi reżyserki na ten
The
temat
director's statements on how the film was made seem completely unrealistic and indicate that she likely must have had some sort of agreement with the Ministry of Defense, the Army, or the Special Services if she was able to go to the front line. Let's also add that her very presence there violated international law, because legally it is Ukrainian territory, and she, as a Russian citizen there with a Russian army, by definition, could only have been there illegally. This alone is controversial, and we need to ask how the festival organizers allowed a film made in this way to be included in the screening.
Because I've lived for half of my life in the West and for half of my life in Russia, and I like and respect both of these places and people and traditions. I would like this film to be maybe not a bridge, but at least a rope I can throw across, and to help us see each other. Russian soldiers are not someone whose voices are heard. This story might come as a surprise, perhaps a shock, to people's preconceptions about the war, but I think it's very important to cover the war from both sides and to show people's stories. So not just politicians' statements and not propaganda. And this is my attempt to see through the fog of war and to see people for people. We would never expect that we would be here at the Venice Film Festival. And I'm very grateful for the Venice Film Festival for the fact that they allowed us to show this film, because this is, I think, very important to see the second side of the war that has not been seen before. For myself, I spent 7 months with these soldiers. And over the 7 months, what I filmed is pretty much what you saw. Obviously, there's a lot of materials, but we didn't hide anything from the audience. And I got the chance to pretty much go anywhere and everywhere, well, within the battalion, as long as it was not too close to the command, I guess. So everything that you saw, their reality, was this. And I understand that there were so many reports of war crimes, and pretty much, I think in Western media, that's what Russian soldiers are associated with at this point, because there were no other stories. This is another story, and this was the reality that they lived. If there were war crimes committed, obviously you would see them on screen. But in the 7 months that I was there, that was not my experience.
And what did you wear? I had a long gray coat. I especially chose it to match the color of the trench. My shoes were also gray. They told me, "You're crazy. Take normal ones. You'll die in these shoes." Well, the uniform was very warm. Very warm? Yes, very warm. When I returned to civilian life, I started to notice it more and more. It's often worn by fishermen and security guards.
Ciekawostką jest również to,
It is also interesting to note that, according to the information made publicly available, the film was partially financed by the Canada Media Fund. And another question arises as to how the Russian services or the Russian authorities, which monitor the situation on the front very closely, could have allowed a director working with money from the West to prepare any material on the Russian side of the front. What is most questionable, however, is that according to the director's testimony, as well as excerpts from the film available as part of the trailer, it appears to be a one-sided picture. This is because it focuses exclusively on how the war is perceived by Russian soldiers, and among other things, what doubts they have, what their motivation is. It's a very emotional picture. In contrast, nothing is said about what context these soldiers are in, that Russia is the aggressor that invaded Ukraine and is waging a deadly war there. The director focuses on how close and warm a relationship she managed to build with the soldiers, thus softening their image and showing their human face. This portrayal of the war from the Russian side is very much in line with the image that is built by Russian propaganda, which tries to evoke positive emotions and solidarity and empathy towards its soldiers and actually seeks to equate the positions of aggressor and victim. And this film, according to the director's statement, also plays this role. Its aim is to confuse and muddy the image and show that there are people on both sides of the front, and the responsibility, therefore, for the war does not lie with either side.
If we can humanize or not humanize someone. So are there lists of people who we can humanize and lists of people who we can't? Of course, we have to humanize everyone. This is a huge tragedy for our region, first of all, and for the entire world. And if we don't see each other as people, if we reserve to these black and white stereotypes about each other, this will only make the war continue. This will only make the hatred grow. And to me, the biggest shock was to see how ordinary they were, like absolutely ordinary guys, with families, with a sense of humor, with their own understanding of what's happening in this war, and they were very respectful towards me. Like, I never had this feeling that I was in some sort of danger from them.
Główną cechą rosyjskiej propagandy i główną...
The main feature of Russian propaganda and the main narrative that Russian propaganda tries to build is that it is actually difficult to establish the origin of the war, who started it, and who is to blame. The main statement that very often comes up in the propaganda is the Russian statement "Nie всё так однозначно." That is, that not everything is so clear, that everyone has their own rationale and the truth is not really straightforward. This is what this film seems to do, and it aims to convince us that Russians also have their human side. And in my opinion, this is a very dangerous symmetry.
Я помню родителям, говорю, я хочу военное, где-то смерть семьи. Товарищи уже для меня семья.
Да, естественно, все здесь кого-то.
Bardzo ciekawym również zabiegiem.
Appealing to emotions is another interesting tool. In her statements, as well as in the film, the director refers to various situations from the life of soldiers at the front, which are meant to evoke warm, positive feelings and empathy towards the soldiers. Above all, the point is that she appeals to emotions, not to facts. And here, a red light should have already lit up because appealing to emotions is a very common technique used by propaganda. In order to divert attention from the facts, propaganda typically appeals precisely to our feelings. The last argument, which only reinforces the previous allegations against the film and the legitimacy of its public screening, is that, according to media evidence, the director previously worked for the Russian television channel RT, and in cooperation with its station made various documentaries, among others reporting on the situation in Syria, where she was probably also in cooperation with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. All of this means that we can look at this documentary and the entire operation around promoting it as another influence operation organized by Russia, which was prepared well in advance and with great precision, and at this point is intended to influence how Russia and the role of Russians in this war is perceived by the West.
So to say that this film is whitewashing Russian war crimes is false. It's a political accusation, and I believe that it's completely unfounded, because you cannot expect a documentary filmmaker, first of all, to be everywhere at once, and also to cover things that were seen by international criminal court investigators on the Ukrainian side. At the same time, one of the other accusations was, why did I not film on the Ukrainian side? Well, because if I went there as a Russian, I would be killed. Most likely.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss more coverage like this one from the region.